What happens when centuries of power are poured into one bloodline until it breaks? This is the story of a king who should never have been born. A boy who sat on the throne of the mightiest empire on earth, but couldn't walk, couldn't speak, and couldn't eat without choking. His name was Charles II of Spain, and his life was not a reign. It was a slow-motion collapse of flesh, of crown of empire. If you think history is just about battles and dates, think again. This is not a biography. This is a warning. On a bitter November night in 1661, the royal palace of Madrid prepared to welcome a future king. Instead, it birthed a warning from nature. Queen Mariana of Austria, pale and trembling, looked down at the child in her arms, and for a moment time seemed to stop. The baby did not cry. His jaw jutted grotesquely forward. His eyes stared blankly into space. His limbs were limp thin as reeds. His tongue lolled from his mouth like that of a dying animal. This was Charles, Prince of Asturias, heir to the mightiest empire on earth. But from the moment of his first breath, the world knew he was wrong. Not just sickly, not just fragile wrong. Behind the gold-threaded curtains, doctors exchanged glances of dread. Nurses crossed themselves. Mariana, just 24 years old, had produced not a savior for Spain, but the living echo of a bloodline stretched beyond its limits. She did not scream. She did not speak. She simply held him tighter, as if by doing so she could hide from God what he had just delivered. From that moment forward, the story of Charles II was no longer just his own. It became the slow public unraveling of a dynasty, a catastrophe written not in war or rebellion, but in chromosomes. Spain had built an empire so vast the sun never set on its lands. But now in a gilded crib lay the evidence that all its wealth, all its conquests, all its divine claims had led to this, a child who could not close his mouth. Word of his condition never reached the public, at least not truthfully. Official portraits were delayed. Physicians were sworn to silence. The royal family insisted that the child was merely delicate. Yet whispers grew even across borders. Ambassadors reported rumors back to foreign courts that Spain's prince could not nurse, could not move, could not even blink like other infants. And in the shadows, foreign kings smiled. Because empires don't always fall to swords. Sometimes they fall to silence, to deformity, to one broken boy with a golden crown. To understand why Charles II was born broken, we must climb back up the branches of a family tree that had been poisoned for generations. The Habsburgs were not just a royal house. They were an empire machine, ruthless, calculating, obsessed with legacy. By the 16th century, they controlled vast territories across Europe and the Americas. Spain, the Low Countries, parts of Italy, the New World. It was all theirs. Not by chance, but by marriage. Marriage not to strangers, but to cousins. Nieces, uncles, sisters-in-law. Over and over again. They called it strategic union. But nature had another name for it, genetic collapse. It began innocently enough. Charles III, the first Habsburg to sit on the Spanish throne, was a warrior king, intelligent and charismatic. Under his reign, Spain became the world's first global superpower. His son Philip II expanded it even further, ruling from the monastic palace of El Escorial, with a cold iron will and a terrifying devotion to Catholic orthodoxy. But with each new royal wedding came a tightening of the bloodline. Philip married his niece. His son, Philip III, married his cousin. And so it went. Generation after generation, they ignored biology in favor of dynastic purity. They believed they were preserving divine right. Instead, they were building a time bomb in human flesh. At first, the symptoms were mild, a slack jaw, a tendency toward melancholy, a little frailty. But the damage was accumulating, silently, invisibly. Every union shaved away genetic diversity. Every royal birth carried a heavier burden. By the time Charles's father, Philip IV, took the throne, the effects could no longer be hidden. His children died in infancy. His own features, long face, weak chin, low stamina, marked him as a man, bred too closely within his own house. Still, they persisted. In a final act of hereditary desperation, Philip IV married his own niece, Mariana of Austria. From that union came Charles. He was not a tragedy. He was the inevitable outcome. A life formed not by love, but by calculation. Not by nature, but by its defiance. They had tried to bend the laws of inheritance to serve power, but power does not protect the body. Not from rot, not from time. Charles's first years were not filled with laughter or learning, but with silence, sickness, and suspicion. He did not crawl. He did not babble. When he cried, it was more of a gurgling groan. His jaw was so distended, his tongue too swollen, that he could not even close his mouth. Feeding him became a daily ritual of fear. His food had to be mashed to liquid, poured into special spoons, and held at precise angles to keep him from choking. The doctors were helpless. The Queen was terrified. Mariana, now a mother to a child she both adored and feared, refused to accept what was plain to see. She ordered round-the-clock care. She personally selected tutors, priests, and physicians, none of whom could change the fact that her son could barely move, barely respond, barely live. To the outside world, Charles was a slow child. But within the palace, the truth was carefully buried under layers of ceremony and fear. Only a trusted circle ever saw him, always under tightly controlled conditions. Even portraits were painted with creative liberties, hiding his sunken jaw, his glassy stare, and the drool that constantly spilled from his lips. Foreign ambassadors weren't fooled. Reports smuggled out of Madrid spoke of a haunted boy, a silent prince, a child whose breath is a curse. Other nations began to see Spain not as a threat, but as a dying beast. And yet, he was still the heir, still the future king. By age 5, Charles could not walk without help. By age 7, he had uttered no full sentence. Tutors tried games music, even shock therapy to provoke response. Nothing worked. His mind was locked behind a face frozen in vacancy. The court adapted. Everything in his world was adjusted to fit his limitations. He was moved like a doll, dressed like a relic, paraded for ceremony, but never allowed to speak. Even servants were forbidden from using certain words around him. No weak, no mad, no cursed. The entire Spanish Empire was being held together by a lie that their future was intact, that the boy in the gold-trimmed robe was capable of becoming king. In truth, Charles could not command his limbs, let alone a kingdom. In 1665, the inevitable happened. King Philip IV, exhausted, disoriented, and broken by age and grief, finally died. And with him, Spain's last functioning monarch. His son Charles, just 4 years old, became King of Spain. He could not speak. He could not write. He could not even stand for long on his own. Yet he wore the crown. The coronation was less a royal ritual and more a carefully choreographed illusion. The crown had to be resized for Charles's oversized skull. A bishop recited the royal oath on his behalf. And as the crowds cheered, they did not know that the child king had no idea what was happening. Spain had a king in name only, a puppet, a shell. Queen Mariana assumed the regency, but she did not rule as a sovereign. She ruled as a mother, shielding her broken child from a world he could never survive. Every royal decree bore his name, but none his will. Ministers guided his hand across documents, producing scrawled symbols that passed as royal signatures. Behind palace walls, Spain's government became theater. Elaborate routines were invented to maintain the illusion. Daily audiences were shortened. Foreign dignitaries were limited, and all public appearances were rehearsed like stage plays. The boy on the throne was never allowed to break character, but the world outside was watching and learning. France under the rising sun, King Louis XIV tested the Spanish border. The Dutch pressed their trade advantages. The Spanish Netherlands, once a jewel of the empire, became a political liability. Wars began to chip away at Spain's borders, not because of foreign brilliance, but because the empire had no one left to steer it. Charles was growing older, but not stronger. His gait remained unstable, his words unintelligible, his gaze disconnected. Advisors spoke to him like a child, not a ruler. Decisions were made in his name, but never by his will. And yet royal duty demanded one more impossible burden marriage. A king must produce an heir. So in 1679, the court arranged a marriage between Charles and Marie-Louise of Orléans, a radiant French princess, barely 17. She arrived in Madrid expecting a royal husband. She found a man who resembled neither a groom nor a monarch. Behind closed doors, Marie-Louise wept. Contemporaries whispered that the marriage was never consummated, that the king did not understand what a wife was, that his body could not perform what nature required. Still, the fiction endured. Public celebrations, royal banquets, hopes of a child. Years passed and no heir came. The Spanish court clung to the illusion. But behind their gold-threaded curtains, the truth was undeniable. The king could not rule, and he could not reproduce. The crown sat atop a man who would end a dynasty by simply being alive. By the 1680s, the Spanish Empire was no longer decaying. It was decomposing. What had once been the richest empire in the world, a realm where the sun never set, was now riddled with rebellion, corruption, and neglect. But no enemy had truly conquered Spain. Its defeat came from within, from the throne itself. Charles, now in his 20s, had not improved with age. He was taller, yes, but bent and slow. His tongue still protruded. His jaw, now massive and gnarled, prevented proper speech. Most of his meals were liquid, and even those often made him choke. Doctors, dozens of them, rotated through the royal household, prescribing leeches, herbal baths, prayers, and even exorcisms. Nothing worked. Some whispered the king was possessed. Others believed God had turned his face away from the Habsburgs for their pride and incest. The court, desperate for hope, arranged a second marriage in 1690 after the death of Marie-Louise. This time to Mariana of Neuburg, daughter of a German elector. But hope quickly faded. The queen, educated and pragmatic, found herself trapped in a life of fiction. Her new husband could barely recognize her. Conversations were impossible. Affection, even staged affection, required careful direction. Worse still, Charles's body had begun to break down entirely. Seizures came without warning. His eyesight faded. He often soiled himself in public. And yet, he remained king. The government functioned as a ghost ship drifting on tradition, ceremony, and lies. Ministers signed decrees in his name. Military orders bore his seal. But Charles understood none of it. Spain lost Naples. Sicily rebelled. Trade routes collapsed. The once mighty Spanish fleet rotted in harbors. In the colonies, governors began ignoring orders from Madrid, acting independently. In the Americas, local power structures filled the vacuum left by an invisible monarchy. Foreign powers saw opportunity. The British, the French, the Austrians, they began dividing up Spain's future, while Charles still lived. Inside the court, the vultures circled too. Noble families once united under the crown now plotted their futures in secret. Who would inherit the empire once Charles died, childless? Who would control the vast New World wealth? Who would claim the broken throne? The Spanish Inquisition, once an instrument of terror, now turned inward, investigating whispers of curses, witchcraft, and divine punishment. Because how else could one explain a king who could not speak, could not father children, could not rule, and yet would not die? The empire was rotting, not from rebellion, not from invasion, but from a slow, unnatural decay that began in a womb and spread across the globe. On the first day of November 1700, Charles II of Spain died. He was 39 years old, but looked far older. His body was skeletal. His skin had lost all color. His jaw, now grotesquely distended, hung open in death as it had in life. Those who were there said his final moments were not peaceful, but agonizing. He suffered seizures that shook the entire bed. His eyes rolled back. He groaned like an animal. He did not speak. He did not recognize his wife. He did not understand that he was dying, but the empire understood. With his final breath, the Spanish Habsburg line ended. There were no children, no heirs, no future. His will written not by him, but by courtiers and factions competing for power, named Philip of Anjou, a Bourbon prince and grandson of Louis XIV, as his successor. And with that decision, Spain handed its throne to the very dynasty it had fought for generations. The War of Spanish Succession erupted less than 2 months later. 10 years of bloodshed, millions of lives lost, and the permanent redrawing of Europe's political map, all set in motion by a man who could not write his own name. Charles never led armies. He never passed laws. He never ruled in any true sense. Yet his existence, his tragic, haunted existence, triggered one of the most consequential conflicts in European history. The Spanish Empire, once unparalleled, fractured. Its territories in Italy and the Low Countries fell under Austrian control. Britain seized Gibraltar and gained influence over global trade. France planted its roots in Spanish politics. And Spain itself, once feared and revered, became a ghost of its former self. In the end, all that remained were ruins, empty palaces, broken thrones, portraits of men with proud chins and hollow eyes. Charles's life, for all its suffering, taught no lesson to his contemporaries. But to us, it should mean everything. Charles II was not a monster. He was not even truly a king. He was a consequence of arrogance, of ignorance, of a belief that bloodlines mattered more than humanity. His face bore the weight of 2 centuries of inbreeding. His silence echoed the denial of a court that refused to listen to nature. His death was not the end of a man, but of a dynasty that believed it could outwit biology. History often glorifies empires. We build monuments to their victories, paint portraits of their rulers, and write poetry about their power. But Charles reminds us, empires can rot. Kings can be broken before they begin. And power, when pursued without wisdom, turns inward and devours itself. If you were moved by this tragic story, help us keep history alive. Like, subscribe, and share this video. And tell us in the comments, was Charles II a victim, a warning, or both?